Everybody. I am here to talk about the Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan and to do a little bit of exercise. Now is a good time for me to take a break from sitting at my desk and get a little bit of movement in. I've been sitting for about 2 hours and I need a break. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with the Silk Road. And hopefully you are able to see me still because I don't see anything. All right, there we go. So The Silk Roads is a pretty lengthy book about trade between the East and the West in the ancient world and medieval world. Um, I am not done. I'm like maybe a quarter in the book, but I tend to read at night. And reading at night right before bed means that sometimes I forget things that I've read. So I'm going to go over and while I'm walking, just read through my highlights, see what kind of things I remember, and try to have a bit of a review. So the first highlight I made in this book was about how Peter Frankopan used his naming, like sort of his naming schema. And I really liked that he was extremely upfront about the fact that it was a little bit idiosyncratic. A lot of times people will try to be very consistent, but I've noticed in books that I've been reading lately that people have just kind of given up on using a precise naming schema. You see the same thing in Black Falcon and Gray Eagle, something like that. Black Lamb, Gray Falcon, I think, is the title of the book by Rebecca West. And she talks about how hard it is to do transliteration for Yugoslavian names and Croatian phrasing and spelling and all. So it just sort of reminded me of things I'd read before. And like, if like, he's right, if you go through with Trotsky and Khan, like, and you change it up to be perfectly understandable in the context of their own people, then it gets hard for a Western audience. But then he's like, and I avoid Western alternatives for Beijing. So like, it's hard to be consistent. Classification is hard, consistency is hard, and I appreciate that he acknowledged that in the beginning. So here we have the preface. So I took a lot of highlights, and I am honestly not sure that they're not all for the preface. So I'm not sure that I picked up the chapter headings, but that's okay. So we have some highlights about nomads being famous for their ferocity. So this is talking about the steppe nomads of the Eurasian steppes, and we see groups from the Huns, the Shanju, which I think I'm mispronouncing, but I wrote about recently, to the Mongols, and there are still steppe nomads there today, using horses, and like Mongolia is still a country. So throughout history, we've had civilization and then we've had barbarians. Is this sort of tension that we see a lot in Rome, in Roman writing. We see it in Chinese writing. There's this big open space in the middle of these regions to the north, to the north of Persia, and people were really scared of these totally different people who did not settle in cities and did not have the same social structures and did not have the same habits. So, we have this interesting example of cannibalism being accused. And cannibalism definitely is a thing that happened in history. There's an article I wrote about like sacrifice, but I haven't gotten deep into cannibalism. But yeah, some people do eat the flesh of their forefathers. They eat brains. There are all sorts of reasons that it happens. And I didn't know before I read this book that that was a thing that people said about the Eurasian steppes nomads. So the next highlight talks about how Alexander, so this is about Alexander the Great, sort of before Rome. There's a confrontation that he had with the Persian army. A lot of this book so far that I've been reading talks about the conflict between Persia and China and sort of the Greco-Roman area. So we have Southern Europe, we have Southern Eurasia, and then we have Eastern Asia, sort of cupped around the Eurasian steppes. which is, of course, the trade from, east to west with silk and incense and metals and all sorts of things. So we start out in the beginning talking about Alexander the Great, going from Macedonia to the east, and he wins. He defeats Darius. There's this great mosaic I used to show when I was teaching, and I would always ask kids like what they thought was happening in that mosaic. And like Alexander versus Darius was interesting because it was one of the earliest times that the Persians and the West fought, and that conflict continued for generations and centuries, and even into today. Like Persia is the Iranian region, and Iran is still very unhappy with the West. So like this is not irrelevant history. So the next highlight is talking about new cities with powerful defenses, standalone strongholds and forts. They were mostly built to defend against the steppe nomads. And this is interesting because it's in contrast to the Great Wall of China. So I did not know before I read this that there was a sort of similar series of fortifications in Alexander's region of the world to try to protect against the threat of the of the steppe nomads. So this is interesting in the context of, like there's been a lot of politics about building the wall and walls do or don't work. When I was teaching middle school, there was a document-based question modeled on the AP history exam that my students had to answer about whether or not like the Great Wall of China was worth it, and whether it worked, and whether it was worth the price, and the price in lives, and the price in money, and the price in time. And yes, there's always a political debate about it, but this was interesting to me because I didn't even know that the West had a similar series of fortifications. All right, the vibrancy of the cultural exchange as Europe and Asia collided. So this is about cultural diffusion, and statues of the Buddha and Apollo, and this is about the conflict between the Buddhists and like Greek gods, and I didn't know just how much the Buddhists had been influenced by the Greeks. Apparently, before Greek influences, Buddhists didn't really go in for statues. So it's a reminder that like the world changes in response to cultural changes, and a lot of what we think as being extremely representative of a particular religion, like the statue of the Buddha, is not part of its origins. So like Christmas trees, right? Relatively unlikely that they came out of Jerusalem. It's a desert down there. So it's a reminder that these things change over time. So this is talking about the Han Dynasty's waves of expansions, which is in direct contrast to my recent article talking about when the Han were being themselves kind of wrecked by the nomads. So there's a lot of political back and forth between China and the nomads, the settled people and the nomads, really. And the Han Dynasty is, I think, really important, and I don't know very much about it. I haven't made many forays into Chinese history, and I really should, given the role of China on the world stage. And I have friends who have lived in China, and you can't ignore the impact of Chinese AI and Chinese trade on American politics and the world, and just having a better context for the culture and the kinds of conflicts that they've been involved in is I think important, and I'm trying to get better about that. So next we have the expansion of China's horizons linking Asia together. So there's networks of trade that had been blocked. So the Shangyu, which I think I'm mispronouncing, but I wrote about them recently. Like the Scythians in Central Asia were a source of concern, but we're also trading partners for livestock. So, there's this tension between wanting the things that the nomads have, but also not particularly enjoying it when the nomads raid, and not particularly enjoying it when the nomads are not under your control. Like, even if they weren't raiding, nobody really likes to have a powerful hostile force in the border. So they have this trade in horses because obviously steppe nomads are going to have better horses than like settled valleys for a variety of reasons, just including the fact that it is easier to graze them and feed horses on the steppes and do large breeding programs. I used to play this video game called Worm Unlimited and Worm Online. And the thing about trying to breed horses is that you need a lot of horses that you are not necessarily like finding useful. So you have like 50 horses to try to get a combination of the traits that you want, and then you sell the one horse that's actually good. So like you need a lot of space to breed horses, at least from a historical perspective, where like you are starting from not perfect stock. Like once you have the genes that you want, you're basically fine. But in order to get the breeding programs going and produce healthy amounts of animals, you need more. Like the way that we breed dogs now is maybe not so great. And like there's a lot more inbreeding, which isn't necessarily bad. But you need there's a quote somewhere I have in my notes, but you need a large number of things to find an outlier. And if you're doing a breeding program, you're rolling the dice over and over and over again, trying to find the outlier that has the really awesome thing, like is super fast or has a weird colored coat or, is big or small or particularly calm. So you want to roll the dice on the genes a lot in order to increase your odds of getting what you want. You see this in a lot of places, but with horse breeding in particular, I've seen it in video games where you end up with this huge stable of like 1 billion horses because you're trying to breed as many of them as you can so that you can increase your odds of getting the traits that you want. So like it makes sense that would be happening on the Eurasian steppes, although obviously I'm just speculating. So, all right, the most famous and valuable mounts were bred in the Fergana Valley to the far side of the spectacular Premier Mountain Range that straddles what is now eastern Tajikistan and northeastern Afghanistan. So they were strong. Okay, so this is cool. They were described as being sired by dragons, but like sure, dragons, China. But there's this distinctive red perspiration. So like they sweat blood. They sweat red. Nobody is really sure what caused it. It could be because their blood, like they literally just bled very easily because their skin vessels broke. It might have been a parasite. Nobody knows, but it's this cool mental image that I can imagine showing up in a book. Next. Relations with the Xiongnu felt its way across the steppes of Mongolia, across the grasslands to the China's north were not always easy. Tell me something I don't know. Very literally, why did I highlight this? I knew that already. Okay. Oh, willing to eat raw meat and drink blood. I knew that. People have been abandoned by heaven. All right, so here we go. The Chinese proved willing to pay tribute rather than risk attacks from the Shitty. I think I highlighted this because I have this idea in my head about the Danegeld and tribute and whether it works. Appeasement, right? Like whether or not the British should pay appeasement to the Nazis. There are a lot of examples in history of tribute systems and paying off attackers. Like do you pay the pirates to not attack you? Do you pay the gangs in your community to not attack you? And like this comes up in all kinds of books. This comes up in I read something recently, the Jade something. It was a good book, but I can't remember the name of. But it was a riff off of the Yakuza in Japan. And there's this fine line between paying tribute to people who could attack you so they don't attack you and just like a genuine government. And, the libertarians like to say that taxation is theft. And certainly it's difficult to consent when you are a person and not like the government deciding whether or not to fight, the Chinese government deciding whether or not to fight the barbarians. But there's a question of scale and whether scale changes it. And whether it is always foolish to pay the Dane geld, or whether sometimes it just really does mean that you end up with a powerful force defending your trade and not attacking you, and maybe it's not so bad, except sure, maybe you lose power and culture and all that. So, like, it's a question. How well does it work? Does it always not work? Is it always worth it to fight? Sometimes when you fight, you do get wiped out. It is not always sunshine and roses, even though a lot of the books that we read have happy endings. Sometimes people lose. So this other part of the highlight is talking about silk being important. I mean, obviously the Chinese controlled a lot of the silk creation. So this really heavily relates to what I've learned about how exotic luxury goods were used as social signaling in the ancient world. So, like, silk is rare. Red dye in Rome was rare. Red, purple, whatever, like the imperial colors. And there's all these things that, like, I sincerely doubt that your average random nomad or your average rather random Chinese person, like, worried about silk in the way that I particularly worry about caviar. I've never had caviar. It doesn't sound good. I don't really want to eat it. Like, symbol of political and social power. Like, these things are. And there's Derek Guy on Twitter who talks about how you can signal your taste with all kinds of things, but social signaling has been going back to, like, the beginning of humankind as a species. We've been demonstrating our power with clubs and shiny gold and silk and ivory and all sorts of things for a very long time. All right, so next highlight, we think of globalism as a uniquely modern phenomenon, but 2,000 years ago it was a fact of life, and one that presented opportunities, created problems, and prompted technological advance. This just seems trivially true, but also sort of false. Globalization at the elite levels, yeah, but I don't know that it was as easy for a random peasant in China to have a conversation with a random peasant in Rome, much less Britain, 2,000 years ago. So, like, this is also true about trade, but I don't know that it's true about trade in common things. So this was sort of where I started to think, like, okay, you have something in mind that you're trying, like, a point that you're trying to make, but I don't think Peter Frankopan was articulating himself well here. Like, when people talk about the modern phenomenon of globalization, they mean something different than the way it appeared. And I really do think that it matters that TikTok and Twitter are connecting people from all around the world, and, like, actual, like, people, like regular people, not just elites who are managing to get copper from wherever. Like, ancient trade routes, long before civilization was a twinkle in Mesopotamian eyes. Like, we have evidence of, like, obsidian blades traveling halfway across the world through trade routes and stuff, but that's not the same thing that we have in the modern day, and it is misleading to claim otherwise. All right, what made empires great were large numbers of cities producing taxable revenues. What made them culturally spectacular were artisans and craftsmen who developed new ideas, and wealthy patrons competed with each other for their services and rewarded them for their skills. I sometimes wonder how much of this is a just so story, because of most of the records we have coming from artists and craftsmen. And I don't know. Sometimes I have this doubt about what makes cities so important is they produce new art. Like, I don't know that the particular value of New York is art. I don't think the cultural pinnacle is quite so important. There's this quote in a book I read years ago about the War of 1812, from Eric Flint, and he makes this wonderful point that it does not matter if your society produces no art, no books, no unique music, no unique building styles, no particularly impressive architecture. If you are able to defend your land against all comers, and run your own government, then you count as a people. And I think it's a bad idea to allow cultural tastemakers to be the ones defining how important culture at the elite level is. I don't think America can be boiled down to clothing trends in New York. I just don't. I don't. I'm just some lady, but I really don't care what people are arguing about in terms of whether or not Banksy is a genius. It does not matter for the vast majority of American culture. All right. Rome's transition into an empire had little to do with Europe or with establishing control across the continent that was poorly supplied with the kinds of resources and cities that were honeypots of consumers and taxpayers. What propelled Rome into a new era was its reorientation towards the Mediterranean and beyond in the East. Okay, so this is talking about this is talking about how even though the European Union likes to consider itself sort of the cultural successors of Rome, Constantinople in the East was what the Roman government really cared about, because Western Europe was barbaric and useless from a tax revenue perspective. Not literally useless, but like Persia was the jewel that Rome wanted to conquer. They were oriented towards going east. So Augustus sent forces south and east. Like they were really focused on things that were not Britain. Britain was a backwater. The Middle East was where people wanted to do things, which is obviously why eventually the Roman emperors moved their capital to Constantinople, which didn't really work out that well. But what goes up must come down. So it was in some ways inevitable. All right. Oh yeah. So this is about ancient porn. Pretty horrifying. Like they used to use, pornographic images to do sexy times, and then they started bringing in slaves, which was just awful. But this was relevant to silk because this was a time in Roman history when people were getting more liberal with their sex lives and with clothing dresses and that sort of thing. So you see something similar in America where more conservative thinkers will be absolutely horrified that you can see so-and-so's whatever. Like I remember when it was a big scandal when I was a kid, you could see Shania Twain's belly button. Man, like can you imagine what people in the early 1990s would think about somebody like Miley Cyrus or whoever the latest naked person on TV is, Lady Gaga or whatever. I don't follow modern culture. So like man, like Seneca's complaining about silk. And a lot of our conservative thinkers would be thrilled if people would go back to covering themselves with silk. So this highlight is about the Petra, which is one of the wonders of antiquity, and was a city that sat sort of on a major trade route. And I found this interesting because I play Civilization, and I've always I've never bothered to look up what the Petra was. It's just that wonder you build if you have desert, and it turns out that it's like a pretty important, relevant thing, which makes sense. Like the wonders of the world are always indeed wonders of the world, but it was nice to connect what I was reading to a game that I've played for many years. All right, I have written about coinage before, so this highlight is about Rome's spending power and how their coinage went so far east that it actually changed the way that Eastern mints made their things work, their designs. So this is just about cultural diffusion of coinage designs, but I've been writing about coinage and following it for a long time. They think that there are actually 3 places in history that metal coinage was invented. China, I think, had some interesting precursors to metal coins. And then, of course, Lydia is a popular origin point. And there's 1 or 2 other places that are relevant that I don't remember. But this is why I review my notes on my Treadmill, so that I have an easier chance of remembering things later down the line. So, Trajan, whatever. I'm one of those people who learned words from reading, not so much from from listening. Success proved short-lived. A fierce fight back was already underway in the cities of Mesopotamia before the emperor suffered a cerebral edema that killed him, while a revolt began in Judea. Spread quickly. So I don't remember why I highlighted this. Probably just interesting about Judea and revolts. All right, so this is another point about the importance of Asia for Rome and the emperors. But I wrote it down because Valerian, who I think there was some science fiction book about Valerian, not the emperor, just like it was the name. So I'm assuming that guy was named after this guy. But I have some vague memory from the 300 movie, which is obviously a different time period of, this like human footstool, abject form of slavery thing. But I did not know that one of the Roman emperors was treated quite so brutally. This was wild. Like, flayed, dyed his skin and like put it in the temple and stuffed. Like, that's wild. Okay, so the ancient world was pretty brutal. All right, so this is another. So in my last article, I wrote about the Zhongyu sort of uniting into an empire in the face of Chinese pressures. So something similar happened with Persia. Like it transformed into a functional a functional empire again because of the pressure from, I believe, Rome. I think this was in Rome, this empire-wide edict issuing setting prices for staple goods as well as luxury imports. I highlighted this because it reminded me of the recent talks and the American government about maybe doing price controls. And I want to learn more about this because, like, my understanding, and I am not an economist, but my understanding is that prices, like setting prices, is anti-capitalist and causes weird distortions. And I want to know more about how that worked out for Rome, so that I have a better understanding of how it might happen if it happens today. And whether today's economy is fundamentally different from the economy of Rome and the ancient world matters, because it helps me decide whether or not I can use situations from the ancient world as useful analogies for the modern day. So this one I learned something about Diocletian. So Augustus presented himself as a soldier, and Diocletian presented himself as a farmer. And this is important, I think, because you see something similar in American politics where, like, our leaders, our political leaders 200 years ago were in some ways just very different from our political leaders now. Like, we are changing as a country. And the Monroe Doctrine would never fly today, because there's a very strong thread of not liking expansion and thinking that it is immoral to spread as a country and as a culture. But as with business, I think that when you stop spreading, you start shrinking, and there are a wide variety of reasonable opinions to be had. But this idea that Roman emperors changed in their fundamental nature sort of stuck with me. All right, so this was interesting to me because I knew about Constantinople. Obviously, Constantine moved the capital from Rome to the east, but I didn't know that went back so far as Julius Caesar, or that Alexandria and Troy were candidates. But it would be kind of funny if, like, we go from Troy being part of the founding of Rome, and then the Roman capital moving back to Troy. Like, there's an alternative history novel there. That would be pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. If we talk about the Trojans and all the ancient Roman mythology and all that. Anyway, I have done my 30 minutes of walking and reviewed quite a number of highlights in the Silk Roads book that I'm reading by Peter Frankopan, which is quite good. I am glad that I had the opportunity to do a little bit of spaced repetition and remind myself what I learned and what those important things were. So I hope everybody has a good day and gets a little bit of exercise in away from their desks.